The Galactic Court's laughter. The grand chamber of the Galactic High Court was a place of power, a hall where rulers of 100 worlds made their decisions. The air smelled of incense, and the ceiling stretched so high that it disappeared into shadows. The walls, carved from the finest Xarathian stone, shimmered under the floating lanterns. At the center of the massive throne room, Ethan Voss, the only human present, stood tall. He was surrounded by towering Xarathians, their violet skin glistening under the lights. Each one was wrapped in golden ceremonial armor, their wings folded proudly behind their backs, a sign of their status. But Ethan had no wings. And that was the joke. A loud, cruel laughter filled the chamber. The Xarathian king, Zulvex, sat on his throne, his 4 golden eyes narrowing as he looked down at Ethan. His long robes, lined with symbols of war, draped over the massive chair. Beside him, his nobles and warriors sneered, their sharp teeth flashing in amusement. A human, the king scoffed, leaning forward. His voice was deep, powerful, filled with centuries of authority. "Do you know where you stand, creature? Do you even understand the insult you bring by stepping into my court?" Ethan clenched his jaw but did not look away. He had been insulted before. He had been underestimated before. And yet he had always walked out stronger. The warriors standing behind the king laughed again. One of them, a large brute with silver markings on his forehead, stepped forward. His name was General Xarath, one of the most feared warriors in the Empire. "This is a sacred hall, human," Xarath sneered. "Your kind is weak. You do not belong here." Ethan tilted his head, a small smirk appearing on his face. "Weak? That's interesting, because where I come from, strength isn't just about muscles." The laughter stopped. A few nobles shifted uncomfortably. The king's eyes darkened. "Your kind has no strength, no honor. You are a species of scavengers, hiding behind machines, afraid of real combat. The only reason you still exist is because the Galactic Council has not crushed your pathetic world." Ethan let out a slow breath. He had expected this. The Xarathians were proud warriors, known for their belief in physical dominance. In their culture, if you could not fight with your bare hands, you were not worthy of respect. And yet Ethan had not come here to beg. "I challenge the court," Ethan said suddenly. His voice echoed through the chamber. A stunned silence fell over the room. The king's 4 golden eyes widened. "You challenge the court?" A murmur ran through the nobles. The idea was laughable. A single human, standing against the might of the Xarathian warriors. General Xarath chuckled. "And what do you wish to claim, human? Your life? Because that is the only thing you will lose today." Ethan's gaze hardened. This was the moment. The reason he had come here. "I claim the one thing none of your warriors dare to take," Ethan said, his voice unwavering. "I claim Princess Xyra." The reaction was immediate. Gasps, shouts. Some nobles stood up in outrage. Others looked at Ethan as if he had just lost his mind. Even the Xarathian king stiffened, his fingers curling into the armrest of his throne. His expression twisted into something between rage and disbelief. Ethan did not move. He had studied the laws of the Xarathians. He knew that by ancient tradition, a warrior could claim what others had abandoned, as long as they had the strength to keep it. But the disgraced princess. It was unthinkable. King Zulvex's lips curled into a sneer. "You insult my bloodline, human." "I follow your laws," Ethan replied coolly. "You said humans have no honor, but I see no honor in a king who throws away his own daughter." The court erupted into chaos. Several Xarathian warriors stepped forward, their hands reaching for their weapons. The tension in the room turned deadly. Ethan could feel their rage, their hatred burning like fire. But then she appeared. The crowd parted as 2 heavily armored guards dragged a figure forward. Princess Xyra Zulvex. She was nothing like the proud, radiant princess she once was. Her royal garments were in tatters, Her once glorious wings had been clipped, leaving only jagged scars. Her silver eyes, once filled with strength, now burned with cold defiance. She was a fallen warrior. The king looked at her, then back at Ethan. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "Fine," he said, his voice like ice. "Take her. She is your burden now." A hush fell over the court. Zyra stared at Ethan, her gaze unreadable. Ethan stared back. He had just won, but at what cost? The laughter in the court had stopped. Now, there was only silence. And in that silence, a war had just begun. A warrior's honor. The air outside the Galactic High Court was thick with tension. The sun of Xerath Prime cast a deep orange glow across the towering alien structures, their metallic surfaces reflecting the light like a sea of molten gold. But despite the beauty of the city, the crowd gathered outside the court was anything but peaceful. Ethan Voss could feel their stares, hundreds of alien eyes watching him, judging him, hating him. He walked with steady steps, his head held high, leading Princess Tyra Zulvex through the Grand Plaza. The royal guards had released her, but not without a final shove that almost sent her to the ground. Ethan caught her arm before she fell. She immediately jerked away. "Don't touch me, human," she hissed, her silver eyes filled with fury. Ethan sighed but said nothing. He expected this reaction. Lyra was once a warrior princess, respected, feared. Now she was nothing more than an outcast, and he had just claimed her in front of the most powerful beings in the Empire. The people of Xerath would never accept this. From the rooftops, nobles and warriors looked down, whispering among themselves. Some spat in disgust as Ethan passed by. Others simply glared, gripping the hilts of their energy blades as if they were waiting for an excuse to strike. Tyra, walking beside him, had her hands clenched into fists. Her entire body radiated humiliation and barely contained rage. "You are a fool," she said through gritted teeth. "You should have walked away when you had the chance." Ethan smirked but kept his gaze ahead. "And let them keep mocking me. No thanks." Zyra scoffed. "Mockery would have been a better fate than what awaits you now." At that moment, a deep voice boomed across the plaza. "Human." Ethan slowed his steps, already knowing what was coming. From the crowd, a towering Xerathian warrior stepped forward, his muscles rippling beneath dark battle armor. His horned crest gleamed under the sunlight, marking him as a noble of high status. The crowd fell silent, watching the confrontation with eager eyes. Xera inhaled sharply. "That's Valak, son of General Saurath. He's one of the finest duelists in the Empire." Ethan kept his face neutral. "And?" Zyra whipped her head toward him, her eyes flashing. "And you're about to die." Valak stomped forward, his massive spear resting on his shoulder. His two golden eyes burned with hate as he glared at Ethan. "You are no warrior," he spat. "You are a thief who stole what he cannot protect." Ethan sighed. He really wasn't in the mood for this. "I didn't steal anything," Ethan said. "I followed your laws." Valak's grip tightened around his spear. Laws mean nothing when the one taking advantage of them is an unworthy insect. The crowd murmured in agreement. The tension was rising. Then, Valak pointed his spear at Zyra. "She belongs to me," he declared. "I claim her as my prize." Zyra's breath caught in her throat. The words rang out like a death sentence. The Xerathian warrior code was clear. If Ethan was too weak to defend his claim, anyone could challenge him and take Zyra for themselves. Ethan tilted his head, cracking his knuckles. "You sure you want to do this, big guy?" The crowd gasped at the sheer arrogance in his tone. Zyra's eyes widened. "Ethan." Valak growled, slamming his spear into the ground. The shockwave sent dust flying into the air. "Face me in combat, human, or run like the coward you are." Ethan chuckled, rolling his shoulders. Finally, something he understood. The plaza cleared instantly, giving them space. Valak lunged forward, his spear slicing through the air with deadly speed. Ethan moved. To the Exarathians watching, it was impossible. Valak's spear should have skewered him instantly, yet the human sidestepped with ease, his body moving with unnatural grace. Valak roared, swinging again, this time with a downward slash, aiming to cleave Ethan in half. Ethan ducked. Then, in a flash, he slammed his fist into Valak's ribs. A crack echoed through the plaza. Valak stumbled back, gasping. He looked down at his armor, a dent where Ethan's fist had struck. The crowd froze. No human should be able to do this. Valak's shock turned into rage. He charged again, but Ethan was already moving. He weaved around the spear, closed the distance, and drove his elbow straight into Valak's jaw. A loud crack. Valak's head snapped back. His eyes rolled into his skull. And then, he collapsed. Silence. The crowd stood in stunned disbelief. A human had just defeated one of their strongest warriors. Ethan took a deep breath, then turned to Xyra, grinning. "You were saying?" She stared at him, speechless. Valak's body lay in the dust, unconscious. The crowd erupted into chaos. Some shouted in rage. Others whispered in fear. Ethan knew what this meant. He was no longer just an outsider. He was now a threat. And soon, the entire empire would know his name. The truth about Xyra. The streets of Xrf Prime were alive with whispers. News of the humans' victory had spread like wildfire. A human defeated Valak. It was unheard of. It was impossible. Yet Ethan Voss had done it. Now, as he walked through the massive sky-lit avenues, the tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. Xyra Zulvex, the fallen princess, walked beside him, her hands clenched into fists. She had been silent since the duel. She had watched him move like a predator, watched him break a Xarathian warrior with nothing but his bare hands. She hated it. She hated the fact that she felt impressed. The golden towers of the capital city loomed above them, their spires reaching into the sky like the claws of some ancient beast. The roads beneath their feet were lined with glowing energy veins, channeling power from the planet's core. Around them, Xarathians whispered. Some averted their gaze. Others stared openly, their expressions a mix of curiosity, anger, and fear. For the first time in her life, Xyra was not the center of attention. It was him. It was the human. She stole a glance at Ethan. He walked like a warrior, but not like a Xarathian. His steps were too relaxed, his posture too casual. There was no arrogance in his stride, only confidence. That unnerved her. At last, she spoke. "Where are you taking me?" Ethan didn't look at her. "Away from here." Xyra narrowed her eyes. "That much is obvious. Fool. I meant where exactly." He sighed, finally stopping at the edge of a massive hoverbridge overlooking the glowing city below. He turned to her, leaning against the metal railing. "Somewhere safe," he said. Xyra let out a bitter laugh. "Safe? There is no safe for me, human. My father made sure of that." Ethan folded his arms, studying her carefully. "Why?" he asked simply. Xyra's jaw clenched. "Why what? Why did he turn against you?" She stiffened, her eyes flashing with something between anger and pain. She wanted to ignore him. She wanted to walk away and leave him in his ignorance. But something about the way he looked at her, with curiosity, not judgment, made her talk. So she told him. She told him everything. The fall of a princess. She had once been the pride of the Xarathian Empire, the only daughter of King Zulvex, born into power, trained from childhood to be a warrior of legend. She was faster than her brothers, sharper than her teachers. She commanded fleets, led warriors into battle, brought glory to the empire. But it was never enough. Her father had other plans for her. She was not meant to be a warrior. She was meant to be a prize. Xyra's fists tightened as she spoke. "He wanted me to marry warlord Sokar." Ethan recognized the name instantly. the warlord he had defeated in the blood arena. He was 3 times my age. Tyra continued, her voice dripping with bitterness. But he was powerful. He commanded 100 fleets. My father saw an alliance with him as beneficial. Ethan frowned. And you refused. Xyra let out a cold laugh. I didn't just refuse. I fought him. Publicly. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Let me guess. You won. She smirked, but it didn't reach her eyes. I broke him. The way she said it sent a chill down Ethan's spine. He tried to force me. Kyra continued, her voice turning darker. I challenged him in front of my father's court. He laughed, thinking it would be easy. But I humiliated him. I beat him into the ground, left him bleeding in front of the entire empire. Ethan exhaled. And that's why your father turned against you. Tyra nodded. My father believes in strength, but only when it serves his rule. I was supposed to obey, to kneel, to let him decide my future. When I didn't, he called me a disgrace. He clipped my wings, stripped me of my rank, and cast me out like I was nothing. She paused. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, she looked at Ethan. And now you have made things even worse, she said, her voice bitter. You didn't just claim me. You challenged the very foundation of their beliefs. Ethan smirked. Good. Xyra stared at him. You're insane. He shrugged. Maybe, but I don't like bullies. She shook her head in disbelief. You still don't understand. You think you won today, but you have only made yourself a target. Ethan's smile faded. Let them come, he said quietly. I've been fighting my whole life. This is nothing new to me. Xyra studied him for a long moment. Then, to her own surprise, she found herself saying, You really are different, aren't you? Ethan chuckled. You have no idea. But before Xyra could reply, a deep roar echoed through the city. The hoverbridge shook beneath them. Xyra's blood ran cold. She knew that sound. The king's elite enforcers. Ethan tensed, his instincts flaring. What was that? Xyra turned to him, her expression grave. They're coming for you, human. The hunt begins. The next few moments were chaos. From the massive towers above, Azarathian warships descended, their dark metal hulls gleaming under the artificial lights of the city. Soldiers in black armor dropped onto the hoverbridge, weapons drawn, surrounding them in seconds. A voice boomed through a hidden transmission speaker. Human, by order of King Zulvex, you are to be taken prisoner. Surrender now. Ethan cracked his knuckles. Not happening. Xyra turned to him. You cannot fight them all, Ethan. He glanced at her, smirking. Watch me. And then, he moved. With inhuman speed, he dodged the first energy blast, disarmed the nearest soldier, and sent him crashing off the bridge with a single strike. Xyra barely had time to react before Ethan grabbed her wrist. Hold on, he said. And then, they jumped. Xyra's scream was lost in the wind as they plummeted toward the neon-lit depths of the city below. Above them, the warships roared in frustration. The hunt had begun, and the entire empire was now watching. The challenge of the blood arena. The wind roared past Xyra's ears as she plummeted through the glowing depths of Xerath Prime's megacity. For a moment, all she could see was the blur of towering structures, golden lights, and the flashing red glow of pursuing warships above. And then strong hands gripped her waist. Ethan. Before she could react, he twisted in midair, kicking off a passing sky barge, angling their descent toward a lower level of the city. They crashed onto a moving hover transport, rolling across the metallic surface before coming to a stop. Xyra gasped, her heart slamming against her ribs. Ethan lay beside her, grinning despite the bruises forming on his arms. Told you to hold on. She punched his shoulder, breathing hard. You're insane. Ethan chuckled as he pulled himself up, glancing skyward. The black-armored enforcers were already circling above, their ships scanning the area. They had only seconds before the hunt resumed. Zira sat up, brushing strands of silver hair from her face. "We can't stay here. The enforcers will track our energy signatures." Ethan smirked. "Then let's give them a distraction." Zira blinked. "What are you planning?" Ethan reached into his jacket, pulling out a small detonation charge. "Just a little gift for our pursuers." Zira stared at him. "You planned for this?" He shrugged. "I don't like surprises. And I really don't like being chased." Before she could argue, Ethan threw the charge onto the transport's power conduit and grabbed her hand. Time to run. A city in chaos. The explosion rocked the entire level of the city. A burst of blue fire erupted from the transport, sending debris raining down onto the lower districts. The warships above hesitated, momentarily thrown off by the sudden chaos. Ethan and Sarah sprinted through the narrow alleyways of Sector 9, weaving through towering neon-lit skyscrapers and bustling streets. The common citizens of Xareth Prime barely noticed them. Most were too busy ducking for cover as alarms blared across the city. Zara stole a glance at Ethan as they ran. Who was this man? She had seen Sarathian warriors flee when faced with enforcers. But this human, he was smiling. She shook her head. "You enjoy this, don't you?" Ethan grinned, dodging a falling metal beam. "Adrenaline's good for the soul." Zira rolled her eyes. "You're impossible." Suddenly, a holographic projection appeared in the sky, flickering into view above the city. The image of King Zulvex filled the skyline. "People of Xareth Prime, hear me." His deep voice rippled through the air, carrying a weight of authority that made even the most rebellious citizens pause. "The human known as Ethan Voss has defied the honor of our empire. He has stolen what is not his. He has insulted our traditions." Zira's stomach tightened. She knew what was coming next. And sure enough, let him prove his strength. The king's golden eyes gleamed with cruel amusement. "I invoke the right of the blood arena." A collective gasp rippled through the city. Zira stopped in her tracks. "No." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "What's the blood arena?" She turned to him, her face pale with fury. "A death sentence. The blood arena. A warrior's nightmare." They didn't get a choice. Before they could escape, the king's personal guards descended upon them, not to kill, but to capture. Ethan fought. Of course, he fought. But even he couldn't take down an entire squad of elite warriors alone. By the time the fight ended, he was on his knees, his wrists shackled in energy restraints. Zira knelt beside him, her own wrists bound. She glared at her father's warriors, but they ignored her. The next thing Ethan knew, he was being dragged through a massive stone gateway, the air thick with the scent of blood and dust. The blood arena. It was an ancient coliseum, built into the heart of Xareth Prime, a place where warriors fought to prove their worth, or to die. The crowd roared as Ethan was thrown into the center of the battlefield, his shackles unlocking as he hit the ground. Above him, King Zulvex watched from his royal balcony, his expression unreadable. Beside him, Cyrus stood in chains, her silver eyes burning with helpless rage. The king's voice boomed through the arena. "You wish to claim a warrior's prize, human. Then fight as a warrior. Survive, and perhaps we will consider you worthy." The gates on the far side of the arena opened, and out stepped his opponent. Ethan's breath hitched. The Xarathian warrior was unlike anything he had seen before. Towering at nearly 9 feet, its muscular body was reinforced with cybernetic enhancements. A war machine. The legendary champion of the blood arena. The crowd screamed its name. Keorthian. Zira's voice cut through the noise. "Ethan, you can't win this fight." "He's." Her words were lost as a loud gong sounded. The fight had begun. The battle of legends. Korthan moved like a beast unleashed. The ground trembled as he charged, his massive fists swinging with the force of a wrecking ball. Ethan barely dodged in time, rolling to the side as the impact shattered the arena floor. Too strong. Too fast. Ethan's instincts screamed at him. This was different from his fight with Valak. This wasn't a duel. This was a slaughter. Korthan lunged again, his fists glowing with raw energy. Ethan ducked, countering with a sharp strike to the ribs. But it was like hitting solid steel. Korthan grinned. Weak. He grabbed Ethan by the throat and lifted him off the ground. The crowd erupted in cheers. Zara struggled against her chains. No. Korthan tightened his grip. You are not worthy of her. Ethan's vision blurred. His lungs burned. But then, a memory flashed through his mind. A voice from his past. You don't have to be the strongest. You just have to be the smartest. Ethan's lips curled into a smirk. And then, he brought both hands up, clapping them hard against Korthan's ears. The sudden shockwave disoriented the warrior, his grip loosening just enough for Ethan to drive his knee into his stomach. Korthan staggered back, stunned. Ethan landed on the ground, rolling away. The crowd went silent. For the first time in centuries, someone had landed a hit on Korthan. Ethan wiped blood from his mouth, grinning. Round 2. Zyra watched from above, her heart pounding. For the first time, she believed he could win. And if he did, it would change the Empire forever. The arena roars. The Colosseum shook with the voices of thousands of Xerathians, their roars echoing off the ancient walls. The sky above was darkened by the towering spires of the city, and yet the arena was lit like a furnace, the fire pits casting long, shifting shadows over the blood-stained sands. At the center of it all stood Ethan Voss, the only human ever to step foot in the blood arena. He wiped a trail of blood from his lips, his breathing steady but labored. His opponent, Korthan, the cybernetically enhanced Xerathian war machine, stood a few feet away, shaking off the stunning blow Ethan had just delivered. The air between them was charged with raw energy. The crowd, once laughing, once mocking, was now deathly silent. For the first time in centuries, their undefeated champion had been hit. For the first time in history, a human had survived longer than a few seconds in the blood arena. And now, they all waited, their golden eyes locked on the impossible battle before them, a warrior's instinct. From the royal balcony, King Zulvex watched with cold amusement. Seated beside him, Princess Syra Zulvex gripped the railing, her silver eyes burning with frustration. And something else. Hope. But she crushed that hope the moment she recognized it. No, he couldn't win. Korthan was not just a warrior. He was a genetic and cybernetic masterpiece, engineered for war, a killing machine designed to destroy entire fleets single-handedly. Even a seasoned Xerathian gladiator wouldn't last more than 5 minutes against him. And yet, Ethan was still standing. She turned to her father, her voice tight. End this. King Zulvex didn't even look at her. Why? The people love a good show. Zara clenched her jaw. You're enjoying this. You want him to suffer. The king finally met her gaze, his 4 golden eyes glinting with cruelty. Of course. He has embarrassed me. He has embarrassed our people. And when Korthan tears him apart, the entire empire will understand that a human is nothing compared to a true warrior. Zyra's nails dug into her palms. He doesn't understand. He doesn't see what I see. Ethan isn't fighting like a Xerathian. He isn't trying to overpower Korthan. He's adapting. And that's what makes him dangerous. Korthan strikes. In the arena, Korthan moved first. A blinding burst of speed, his cybernetic limbs accelerating as he closed the distance in seconds. Ethan barely had time to react before a massive metal fist came crashing down toward his skull. Instinct kicked in. He sidestepped, the impact shattering the ground where he stood just moments before. The dust hadn't even settled when Korthan's left arm shot forward, aiming for Ethan's ribs. Too fast. The blow connected. Ethan felt his ribs crack, his body slamming into the stone walls of the arena. Pain. Blinding, white-hot pain. But he didn't stay down. He forced himself to his feet, spitting blood onto the sand. Corthan frowned. "How are you still moving?" Ethan grinned through the pain. "Guess I don't know when to quit." Corthan growled, his cybernetic eye flashing red. The next attack was coming. Ethan needed a plan. Fast. The mind of a human. Kyra watched, breathless. She had fought in hundreds of battles, trained against some of the best warriors in the galaxy. She knew how Exarethians fought. They were aggressive, overwhelming, powerful. They pushed forward like an unstoppable force, breaking their enemies through sheer strength and endurance. But humans, they fought differently. Ethan was reading Corthan's movements, dodging at the last second, forcing the larger warrior to overcome it. He wasn't just surviving, he was learning. Corthan swung again, but this time, Ethan wasn't there. The human had already moved behind him, delivering a sharp elbow strike to the back of Corthan's knee. A weak spot. Corthan staggered, his balance momentarily broken. The crowd gasped. No one had ever made Corthan stumble. And now they saw it. The human wasn't losing. He was fighting back. A game of speed. Corthan roared, launching himself into a frenzied assault. Ethan dodged every strike, rolling under a massive hook, ducking beneath a spinning kick. Corthan was fast, but Ethan was faster. The Exarethian's frustration was growing. And that's what Ethan wanted. A small, knowing smile formed on his lips. "You're getting sloppy, big guy." Corthan snarled, lunging forward. But Ethan was already moving. At the last second, he sidestepped, grabbed the warrior's extended arm, and used his own momentum against him. Crash. Corthan's massive body slammed into the stone wall, shaking the entire Colosseum. The crowd exploded in disbelief. Zyra's eyes widened. He's winning. Her father's hands tightened around the armrest of his throne. For the first time, King Zulvex looked unsure. The final blow. Corthan staggered to his feet, dazed. Ethan rolled his shoulders. Had enough. The warrior growled, his body trembling. "I will not lose to a human." Ethan exhaled. "Yeah, you will." Then he moved, faster than before, faster than Corthan could react. Ethan leaped, grabbing onto the warrior's massive shoulders, and drove his knee straight into Corthan's jaw. A sickening crack echoed through the Colosseum. Corthan's eyes rolled back, and then he collapsed. The mighty champion of the blood arena lay motionless in the sand. Silence. Then the crowd erupted. It wasn't mocking laughter anymore. It wasn't jeers. It was roars of shock, of disbelief. For the first time in Exarethian history, their champion had fallen, and a human stood victorious. A king's fury, a kingdom in chaos. Ethan turned toward the royal balcony, wiping the sweat from his brow. His sharp blue eyes locked onto King Zulvex. The king's face was unreadable. For a moment, the two simply stared at each other. Then Ethan grinned. "I think that means I win." The arena lost its mind. Zyra felt her heart pounding in her chest. Everything was different now. Everything had changed. Ethan Voss was no longer just a human. He was a legend, and her father knew it. King Zulvex slowly stood from his throne, his voice carrying across the Colosseum like thunder. "This is not over." Ethan just smirked. "It's only just begun." A king's fury, a kingdom in chaos. The Colosseum trembled under the weight of thousands of voices, Exarethian warriors, nobles, and citizens alike, all shouting in disbelief, awe, and something new. Respect. Ethan stood victorious, his hands still clenched into fists, his body aching from the brutal fight. The once undefeated champion, Corthan, lay motionless in the blood-stained sand, His massive frame sprawled out beneath the fiery glow of the arena's torches. The impossible had happened. A human had won. Above him, in the royal balcony, King Zulvex's golden eyes burned with something far more dangerous than anger. Cold, calculated, fury. This wasn't just a fight lost. This was an insult, one delivered in front of the entire empire. Ethan wiped a trickle of blood from his lip and tilted his head up, meeting the king's gaze. The silence between them was thick, suffocating. Then Ethan smirked. That means I win, right? A shift in power. Syra felt her breath catch in her throat. The blood arena had rules, and by those rules, Ethan had done the impossible. He had fought. He had survived. He had proven himself. And yet, her father did not move. The king's jaw tightened, his muscles visibly coiling beneath his royal robes. Every inch of his body screamed rage, but his voice remained dangerously calm. "You believe this changes anything, human?" he said, his tone dripping with venom. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "I think it does, unless you're planning to break your own laws." A ripple of murmurs spread through the noble court, the warriors standing at attention beside the king shifting uneasily. They all knew the truth. The law was absolute. Whoever won the blood arena proved their worth. And Ethan Voss had won. Zyra turned to her father, her heart pounding. "You cannot deny it," she said, stepping forward. "He is owed the recognition of a warrior." He. Silence. Her father's voice was like a blade, sharp and final. Zyra clenched her fists, but she said nothing more. She knew what came next. This was no longer about honor. It was about power, the demand. Ethan took a step forward, his boots kicking up the dust of the blood arena as he spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "You made a mistake today, Your Majesty." The crowd gasped. No one spoke to the king that way. Ethan continued. "You thought I was weak, that I wouldn't survive. But here I am, still breathing, still standing. And now, I have a demand." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. A demand. From a human. King Zulvex's eyes flashed with warning. But Ethan didn't stop. "I want her released," Ethan said, jerking his chin toward Syra. The princess stiffened. The court erupted in chaos. Ethan had just demanded the freedom of a disgraced royal. King Zulvex's expression darkened, but before he could reply, Ethan raised a hand. "Oh, and one more thing." He smirked. "I also want a ship." The murmurs turned into shouts. A warrior's demand after winning the blood arena was law, but never had anyone been so bold. The king stepped forward, his hands tightening into fists. "You insult me, human." Ethan shrugged. "You insulted me first. I think we're even." Zyra's breath caught. He's provoking him on purpose. The king knew it too. And yet, he couldn't deny the reality before him. The people of XRF Prime were watching. If he refused outright, it would mean betraying his own laws, and even a king couldn't survive that. Zulvex's teeth clenched so tightly that his jaw muscles rippled. He had no choice. His voice was cold. "Fine." The arena fell silent. Zyra couldn't believe what she had just heard. King Zulvex never yielded. And yet, he had just granted a human's demand. Ethan grinned. "I knew you'd see reason." The entire city felt different now. Something fundamental had shifted. The Exarathian Empire had just taken its first step towards something new. Something terrifying. Because now, a human had power. A kingdom divided. That night, the streets of Exarath Prime were filled with debate. Some warriors shouted in rage, demanding that the king take back his decision, that this human should be executed regardless of tradition. But others, for the first time in history, began to question. If a human could win in the blood arena, if a human could force the king to acknowledge him, then what else were the Exarathians wrong about? And that, more than anything, terrified the rulers of the empire. Escape from the royal palace. Later that night, in the upper levels of the royal fortress, Syra paced back and forth, her mind racing. The corridors of her once beloved home now felt more like a prison. She had been granted her freedom, but only on paper. Her father's warriors still watched her every move. They still expected her to fail. A soft knock at the balcony door made her spin around, hands instinctively reaching for the dagger she no longer carried. Then she heard his voice. "Are you going to let me in, or should I just hang out here?" Syra rushed forward, throwing open the balcony doors. Ethan Voss was standing there, grinning like he hadn't just fought the most dangerous warrior in the galaxy. "How did you get past the guards?" she whispered. Ethan tilted his head toward the edge of the balcony. Syra peered over, and immediately regretted it. Several unconscious Exarathian warriors were sprawled out below, groaning in pain. She turned back to Ethan, eyes wide. "You're insane." He smirked. "You keep saying that." Syra exhaled sharply, rubbing her temples. "What do you want?" Ethan stepped closer, his grin fading into something serious. "You heard the king. I have a ship now." Syra stiffened. And Ethan continued, "I'm leaving this planet." Syra felt something strange twist inside her chest. A part of her had expected this. But now that he had said it, "You should come with me." Her breath caught. She stared at him. Ethan's blue eyes didn't waver. For a long time, she said nothing. Then, finally, she smirked. "Well, human, it's about time you asked." The beginning of a new legend. That night, a single starship lifted off from Serath Prime. It cut through the clouds, breaking free from the atmosphere, leaving the Empire behind. In the cockpit, Ethan leaned back, hands behind his head, grinning. Beside him, Syra watched the planet shrink into the distance. She had spent her entire life believing her fate was set in stone. But now, she was free. And for the first time, she had no idea what came next. But somehow, with Ethan at her side, she couldn't wait to find out. The rise of the human warrior. The stars stretched endlessly before them, a vast ocean of darkness pierced by the glow of distant suns. For the first time in her life, Shira Zolvex was truly free. She stood at the edge of the cockpit, staring at the receding image of Exarath Prime, her homeworld, the planet that had shaped her, broken her, cast her aside. And now she was leaving it behind. Beside her, Ethan Voss sat in the pilot's chair, one hand casually resting on the controls, the other tossing a small metal coin into the air and catching it absent-mindedly. Regretting it yet? He asked without looking at her. Syra scoffed. Regretting what? Escaping with a reckless, battle-hungry human who just threw an entire empire into chaos. Ethan smirked. Exactly. She shook her head, arms crossed. No, but I still don't understand why you did it. Ethan caught the coin and finally turned to her, his blue eyes sharp and unreadable. Did what? Challenged my father, she said. Risked everything. For me. Ethan tilted his head. Didn't feel like much of a risk. Syra let out a dry laugh. You fought the most dangerous warrior in the Empire. You humiliated the king. You became the first human in history to win the blood arena. Ethan leaned back in his chair, stretching. Yeah, well, I've done crazier things. Syra stared at him. I don't believe that. Ethan shrugged, a grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. Guess you'll just have to stick around and find out. A bounty on his head. The ship's holoscreen flickered, a flashing red alert filling the cockpit. Incoming transmission. Priority 1. Ethan raised an eyebrow and tapped the screen. A holographic image of a reptilian creature flickered into view. Its green scales gleamed under the dim lighting of the transmission, its yellow eyes narrowed in amusement. Ethan Voss. The reptilian alien purred, its voice slithering like a snake's hiss. You have made quite a name for yourself. Ethan leaned forward. And you are? The reptilian grinned, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth. "I am Ravik Tar, and I bring you a message." Ethan already knew what was coming next. Ravik's grin widened. "A bounty has been placed on your head. Your little stunt on Xrf Prime. It has the whole galaxy talking." Zyra stiffened. "How much?" Ravik's eyes gleamed. "Enough to turn half the mercenaries in the sector against you." Ethan let out a slow whistle. "Damn, didn't think I was worth that much." Ravik chuckled. "Oh, it gets better. The king himself sent out the order, alive or dead." Ethan's smirk didn't falter. "Good to know I left an impression." Ravik's voice darkened. "You have no idea what you've started, human. The Xarathian Empire will not rest until you are buried beneath the ruins of your own arrogance." Ethan's expression didn't change. He stared straight into the hologram, unflinching. "Well, Ravik, if they want me, they can come and get me." The reptilian alien studied him for a moment before chuckling again. "Brave words, human. We'll see how long you last." The transmission cut out. Silence filled the cockpit. Zyra turned to Ethan, her expression unreadable. "You just challenged the entire mercenary network." Ethan grinned. "Yeah, should be fun. A fleet in pursuit." It didn't take long for Ravik's warning to become reality. Only hours after escaping Xrf Prime, their ship's scanners detected movement, and not just any movement. A fleet. Zyra stiffened, her fingers tightening around the armrest of the co-pilot's seat. "How many?" Ethan glanced at the display. 15 ships, maybe more." Zyra cursed under her breath. "That's a hunting party, probably a mix of mercenaries and royal enforcers." Ethan didn't look worried. If anything, he looked excited. Zyra turned to him sharply. "We can't fight them, Ethan, not with a single ship." He smirked. "Who said we're gonna fight them?" Before Zyra could respond, he slammed the throttle forward. The ship lurched into hyperdrive, streaking into the abyss like a comet. The pursuing fleet followed. And thus, the chase began. The smuggler's shortcut. For hours, the ship twisted through asteroid fields, darted through nebula storms, and skimmed the edges of gravity wells. Ethan piloted like a madman, dodging death by inches, weaving through near-impossible gaps. Zyra, gripping her seat, tried to ignore the fact that she was actually impressed. "You do this often," she muttered. Ethan grinned, jerking the controls to narrowly avoid a plasma blast. "Only when people try to kill me." Zyra rolled her eyes. "So, always." He winked. "You're catching on." The mercenary fleet was relentless, their ships closing in despite Ethan's insane maneuvers. Then suddenly, Ethan made his move. He dived straight toward a nearby planet, a world of crimson storms and jagged mountains. Zyra's eyes widened. "You're not actually going in there." Ethan grinned wider. "Oh, I'm going in." Before she could protest, the ship punched through the atmosphere, vanishing into the chaos of the raging storms below. The crash landing. The moment they hit the atmosphere, everything turned violent. Winds howled like a beast in agony, slamming into the ship with hurricane-force pressure. Lightning cracked across the blood-red sky, illuminating the jagged cliffs and deep canyons below. The engines screamed, warning alarms blaring as Ethan fought the controls. Zyra braced for impact. "This is insane." Ethan flashed her a reckless grin. "Welcome to my life." Then, crash. The ship skidded across the rocky terrain, sparks flying as metal scraped against stone. They finally came to a stop at the edge of a deep ravine. Zyra exhaled sharply, her hands still gripping the seat. "We're alive." Ethan stretched, cracking his neck. "Told you I'm good." Zyra groaned, shaking her head. "You're a lunatic." Ethan smirked. "And yet here you are." The next chapter. As the storm raged on outside, Ethan and Sarah stood at the edge of the ravine, watching as small figures in the distance moved toward them. The mercenaries had followed. Ethan's grin widened. Looks like we got company. Syra sighed, rolling her shoulders. Do you ever stop looking for trouble? Ethan winked. Where's the fun in that? She let out a breath. Then, for the first time since this entire mess started, she smiled. Maybe, just maybe, this was exactly where she was meant to be. And with that thought, she drew her weapon. Ethan cracked his knuckles. The fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning, and the galaxy would never be the same again.